Anyway, it's really great to be here. Thanks you to Harry for inviting me to come and talk to you a little bit about this. What I've done is kind of cobble together a bunch of different talks because I usually don't have 40 minutes. Now, when do I need to be done by? 10:50. Okay. So this could seem a little bit disjoint, but one of the things that's really characterized photovoltaics over the last decades, since really the inception of terrestrial PV in 1975 or 1973, has been the inexorable decrease in manufacturing cost of modules. And this is usually plotted in what's called a learning curve format or experience curve format. It's a log-log plot where the x-axis is the logarithm of the cumulative amount being made, and the y-axis is the logarithm of the sales price. And it's found in the field that it's almost always a straight line. It doesn't really matter what manufactured component you're talking about, whether it's refrigerators or pencils, just about anything. If you plot this up, follows this sort of thing, and remarkably, it almost always follows what's called the same progress ratio, about 80%. That means that every time you double the total experience, the total number of items that you've made, the price is 80% of what it was before you did that doubling. So this is has been a feature of photovoltaics also since the inception, although most of the early workers didn't realize that this would happen. Those that were into learning curves and that sort of thing could really get a pretty good view of what would happen. By the way, the chip industry used this type of knowledge. It was really started at TI for chip manufacturing to essentially destroy their competition very often, because they had such a firm belief in the learning curve. They figured they could price below their manufacturing costs, start manufacturing as fast as possible, and their costs would come down. So it's a sort of a universal thing. Recently, we deviated from the learning curve quite dramatically. If you look at 2008, for example, the module pricing was falling above the learning curve. And this caused some temporary angst in the community. It was caused by a shortage of silicon. But we had sold the policymakers around the world that we were going to keep coming down this experience curve. All they had to do was keep the incentives in place to support the industry. And lo and behold, we were not keeping up our part of the bargain. It turns out that the price of polysilicon skyrocketed to the main raw material for most solar cells. It went from, in 2004, it was around $25 a kilogram. It peaked at over $600 a kilogram. And this, of course, had the standard capitalist impact of bringing in huge numbers of new entrants into manufacturing polysilicon. And recently, that glut has gone away. The red dots here show what was projected for 2009, 10, and 11 by the Prometheus Institute, one of the think tanks that follows our industry, in 2008. The interesting thing is that what actually happened is we slammed right back to the learning curve. So, it's a classic commodity sort of thing. The silicon was in short supply, the price went up, attracted new capacity, there's oversupply of silicon, the price of silicon plummeted. So it's more of an oscillating thing as we go down the learning curve. So we have been marching down this curve, and anybody that wants to get into photovoltaics, I think, needs a very firm grasp of the nature of this learning curve, because it creates a moving target. It's been a problem for every technology that wants to compete with the incumbent silicon, because you might conceive of something that you think has a cost advantage. You then work on it in the laboratory for 5 or 10 years. You think it's ready for commercialization. It takes a long time to commercialize it. convert it into a product, build the factories and that sort of thing. And by the time you're ready to actually sell the product, lo and behold, you look out and you find the entire industry's marched down the learning curve and the price target is much less than what you expected. So it is a moving target industry, and it will be as long as you have exponential growth. By the way, if you want an exercise, I know that this is a university here, you can show that this is a certain percentage drop in price per year is implied by this learning curve if you have exponential growth, constant growth rate, right? So anyway, since the growth of the industry has been fairly constant, but around 20 to 60% throughout this time frame, most of the drops in price on an annual basis are about the same percentage. If we look forward, we fully expect this to continue. This is from a chart that was prepared for what's called the Solar Vision Study, which is being published by the U.S. Department of Energy. And it shows the costs today in 2010 for making a standard multicrystalline silicon module. And if you look at this stacked bar chart, the sales price is around $1.90 per watt. This is already obsolete. The sales prices are quite below that. The manufacturing cost, however, is sort of when you subtract out that top light blue part, is only about $1.30 a watt. So this is a big change, and it's changing the dynamics of the industry tremendously, making it harder and harder to continue to come up with new technologies to compete with the march of the standard generic silicon. The reason for this is that exponential growth implies exponential growth in R&D available funding. Right now, there is probably on the order of $500 million per year in silicon-based R&D funding in the globe. So a lot of engineers working on how to do this and how to squeeze prices or costs out. And you can see the projection as we go forward. The module price is projected to drop below $1 a watt sometime around 2020 to 2030. This will, of course, open up dramatic markets. So let's take a look at these costs. This is the silicon value chain, which you're probably familiar with, starting with polysilicon, growing an ingot, slicing it into a wafer, making that wafer into a solar cell, laminating the solar cells into a panel, and finally placing the panels out in the field. This is this complex value chain that has attracted researchers to somehow come up with something simpler. You know, when one looks at this in 1975, at the beginning of the terrestrial program, before the budget was draconianly cut, as Harry pointed out, by Ronald Reagan, the prevailing wisdom was that this complex value chain could never get its cost down to an acceptable amount. And some other approach had to be taken. And generally, the two approaches that were pursued were either thin films or concentrators. But it's instructive to take this same value chain, which you often see, and actually adjust the lengths of these bars for what it really costs to do each of these steps. So this is now the current breakdown for a generic standard panel. And you can see that if you go across there, the ingot growth, well, that's really only 6%. Making a solar cell out of a wafer is really only 14% of the total cost of getting a system out there. The biggest ones are actually taking those solar cells and laminating behind glass. Why? It's very materials intensive. Glass is thick, glass is heavy, it's laminated with very refined plastics that have an ability to withstand outdoor exposure for 30 years. You know, this is not your basic throwaway water bottle. Then you actually have to put the system out in the field. You have to prepare the site, dig foundations, put steel structures in, transport everything to the field, install it, etc. And that is fully 34%. So if this chart is interesting to do some Gedanken experiments with. Let's suppose that everyone sort of focuses on the wafer is the problem. Gee, the problem with solar cells is the wafer is so expensive. You've got to refine the silicon, grow the ingot, saw the wafer. Well, let's suppose some researcher comes up with a free wafer, okay, who he's going to sell into the industry. That's 12 plus 6 plus 19. What is that? That's 27% of the total system cost is being saved by this breakthrough of a free wafer. Let's suppose, however, that it's not quite as good as a standard solar wafer in terms of its material quality, and therefore it's an even worse LED than a standard solar cell, and it actually has 27% less efficiency relatively. Okay? What have you done? Nothing. You took 27% of the system cost out. Everything else stayed the same to get this thing out in the field. You took 27% of the energy produced out. You broke even for all your effort. That's not a very big difference. A standard solar cell of 16%, you know, if you come up with a free wafer, that solar cell better be 12, I can't do that math in my head right here, but it better be 12 or 13% capable. If it's 8% capable wafer, you're dead. Okay? So it's very important, I think, to understand the cost down the value chain in order to assess what you're doing, the potential impact of what you're doing. I used this chart most recently in a talk on concentrators, and let's suppose we have the solar cell completed. That's only 41% of the total system cost, a complete solar cell. And suppose we want to make a silicon-based concentrator system. Well, then if we concentrate enough, that 41% goes away. Okay? So now we have, but we only get maybe, we lose about 25 or 30% of the energy coming in because the concentrator can't concentrate the diffuse light coming from the sky. We have to add the concentrating element itself. We have the transmission through the concentrator of maybe 90% best case, and boom, do the numbers, you can see it doesn't hunt, right? You just all of a sudden went nowhere. So there's a lot of companies out there that have been started, a lot of research on a lot of directions, which I think with just this simple analysis would convince you probably are dead ends. And by the way, the current total cost in here today is only $2.63 a watt. One thing you need to watch out, so you can figure out what the cost of each element is by just multiplying by that percentage. But one of the things you need to watch out for is oftentimes they mix cost and price, particularly in the case of polysilicon. If you look at the cost to make a module, from the point of view of somebody making the module, if they buy the silicon, that's a cost to them, right? But for the point of view of the person making the silicon, they may be making a huge profit. Where the margin is moves around. So if we go back to the silicon crisis days, silicon was $300 to $600 a kilogram. But the real cost to make it for the cost leaders was only $25 to $28 a kilogram. The rest was profit. Okay, so that's not staying there. To base a concept that you're working on assuming that polysilicon manufacturers are going to somehow be able to make something for $25 and sell it for $600 in perpetuity is a fallacy. It's just not there. So where the margin is in a business like this kind of moves around as the relative strengths of the various players down the value chain change. But the fundamental thing is you can't make the overall cost. So you should look at cost at each thing coming down here. SunPower decided to attack that value chain cost by increasing the efficiency, not decreasing the efficiency. And if you go up here, you can see that we're concentrating on the solar cell. That's that light green part. It's really only 14% of the overall system efficiency. So do the math. Suppose we have a cell that is twice as hard to make. So in effect, it costs us 28% in here. We double the cost element going into making the cell. That means the overall installed system cost is now 1.14 times what you see here. We added that extra 14%. If we increase the efficiency more than 14%, we win. So that's the math that we're applying here. efficiency leverages everything down the value chain. We started in 2000, late 2003, with our first generation product, which is about 20%. I don't really have time to go through all these slides. And we developed a second generation product that we came out with in about 2005, which was around 23%, which we reduced what we call lateral transport losses within the cell. And by the way, another sort of truism of making solar cells is you have to absorb the light, like Eli talked about, ideally in electron hole pair production, right? The sort of excitation that you're looking for. And that's a very important part of the overall process. But the second step is you have to get that energy that's in the free energy of this electron hole gas in there out. Okay. That's actually very often the harder part of the equation. So I often see new people getting into the field saying, well, we've discovered some way to absorb light better or something through some structure. But oftentimes it compromises, when you look at it, it's going to compromise the ability to get that excited energy out of the cell efficiency. So you really need to be thinking not just absorbing it. Absorbing it's pretty easy. You know, black paint absorbs light, right? But it doesn't make a very good solar cell. So be thinking about how you get the energy out of the cell. We reduced what we call the lateral transport losses within the cell by changing the backside geometry. And got to 22%, which is our standard cell that we're in production with today. It used to be, it's kind of interesting in the history of this field, this cell that was first commercialized by Solar Technologies International in 1974, about the same time Exxon bought Solar Power Corporation, was formed. The cells were round, and they were 14.5% efficient. That was the standard generic solar cell. When we began thinking about going into production, we were talking first about making solar cells and selling them to the existing companies. We discussed it with Shell, which was a successor to Solar Technologies International. It was bought by Arco, then bought by Siemens, then bought by Shell. These big companies kind of passed PV companies around like baseball cards for a while. But the cell that Shell was making in 2000 was 14.5% efficient. It was exactly the same process. It was a little bigger, but they had, you saw the learning curve, they had pulled tons of cost out of it. So the concentration within the industry had been on how to drive the cost down, not how to improve the efficiency. Nowadays, efficiency is recognized as the value that it has is well recognized, and we're seeing lots of competition from all of the major players improving efficiencies right behind us. Let's see. I show this slide because we're just announcing a Gen 3 that's going to be going into production in our new Malaysian factory. And this uses this concept of passivated contacts that Eli talked about. You want one, in making a solar cell, if you want to get the energy out, you've got these electrons and holes all running around. You want one contact that sucks electrons out and repels holes, and you want another one that sucks holes out and repels electrons. That's separating the reaction products, really, of the photon being absorbed. And you can do that with diffusions and p-n junctions and things, but it's really a very inefficient way to go. And what people have been looking for is a contact that does that by its very nature. And so we're introducing such a contact in Gen 3. The important point that I want to talk about here is what was called the J0, the saturation current. And notice that it went from 80 femtoamps per square centimeter, and this is and this will tie in with the Shockley-Queisser theory, I'll show you in a minute, all the way down to about 15. So it turns out that that's a number to remember, because the Shockley-Queisser theory that Eli talked about predicts a J0 of an ideal solar cell of 0.26 femtoamps per square centimeter. So the modern cells that we're getting here are only a factor of 20 or 30 or 40 worse than the ideal solar cell of that same band gap, and rapidly closing in on it. make some pretty good LEDs, actually. Let's see, here's a good example of that. We use a lot of emission. We run our solar cells backwards, both in production and in the laboratory, all the time in an LED mode. This shows a wafer, full-size wafer here, running as an LED, and you're seeing the light emission from it. Now, unfortunately, you can't see it because it's in the infrared, but it's so strong that you can easily take a picture of it with a standard CCD camera or a standard cell phone camera. You just shoot a picture of a panel running current through it, running it backwards as an LED, and you'll see it very dramatically. This is shown here just because there's some very interesting physics that goes on inside this growth of the material that are called striations. And the lifetime, the defect density in the cell actually has this radial symmetry and waves that go out due to the material science of the growth process. And so those who are working in silicon solar cells have to understand this very, very carefully because it's very easy to create these striations and remove and destroy the cell efficiency. So our Gen 3 cell now is going to be over 23% that we're coming out with. This shows a module we made with the Gen 3 cells, and a whole module makes a great LED too, quite dramatic. This is a large module in this size, and just running some current through it, shoot the picture with a simple camera, and you can see each of the cells, and in fact how bright each cell is correlates with how good that cell is. The better it is as an LED, the better it will be as a solar cell. There's one that's shorted and it shows up very quickly as a dark cell. Now, this technique of photoluminescence imaging is now standard in the industry. It's amazing how long it took the solar cell industry to embrace this. It is so simple. You can imagine this test could be done in a few milliseconds, right, in production line, and it is now. But, and you can now buy equipment to do this, and it's so obvious, it's amazing that that equipment's only been available for a few years, although we've been doing it with homemade equipment for many years. We actually have now a champion cell that's at 24% conversion efficiency with the new process. So this, what I think I'm going to do, since I don't have as much time as I thought, is skip over some stuff here and go to, we can come back to that in a minute if you want to, but go to this limit efficiency ideas. Okay, so let's put a little flavor around what Eli was talking about with the Shockley-Queisser limit efficiency things. This is a plot of the record laboratory cell efficiency recorded versus year. And you can see this sort of rapid, by the way, how do you make those really cute little red lines? That's the latest in academic technology, isn't it? I like it.
You need to get it down.
Oh, okay. You can see the efficiency rapidly went up into around 14%. Huh? A pointer, okay. And pretty much stayed that of the laboratory cell efficiencies, and here we go. The commercial cells were essentially constant from 1970 to over 2000 at around 14% in that range. But the laboratory cells improved. People working mostly in university laboratories played with the cell structure, gradually understood where the losses were coming from, and ratcheted up the efficiency. So the question is kind of how high can we go? And early on, there were essentially two approaches to that question. There was the thermodynamic approach that was really initiated by Shockley and Queisser, using a sort of detailed balance limit kind of idea. And then there was the people that were actually didn't understand anything about thermodynamics and were sort of semiconductor device guys, and they plugged in the drift and diffusion equations into models. Of course, this is pre-computer models, but so they did analytic models, but they plugged those in there to try and see how well a solar cell should work using your standard semiconductor device equations. And the first guy to really do that to any degree was Mort Prince in the late 50s. And he came up with, if you sort of idealized everything in the semiconductor device model, that it would be around 24% conversion efficiency. Notice that the actual experimental results have exceeded that. Okay, so this was kind of an interesting development. But Shockley came along with his seminal paper and did this detailed balance limit. This is a detailed balance limit for a single junction cell, and which has now been reapplied to every conceivable photovoltaic, sort of turning the crank on every conceivable type of photovoltaic conversion device, whether it's hot carriers or whether it's multiple band gaps or you name it, to come up with its own sort of Shockley-Queisser limit, which are generally higher than the single band gap type limit. So that was sort of the situation. Then the Shockley argument, it was basically that if a solar cell is in equilibrium with surrounded by blackbody radiation, a certain number of blackbody photons are going to hit it that have enough energy to produce electron-hole pairs, just from the background thermal radiation. Now, since the thermal radiation is mostly at very much lower energies at room temperature than the band gap of silicon, it's a small current. And in fact, it's 0.27 femtoamps per square centimeter. Not much current, but there is, femtoamps of current available from background blackbody radiation that would hit the cell and produce electron-hole pairs. And so he's saying, well, gee, in equilibrium, when the cells recombine, everything should be in steady state, so it should be emitting the same amount of radiation back to the blackbody surroundings. And I won't go through the math here, except very rapidly you get sort of a standard diode equation. The main point being that the recombination of electron holes is proportional to the PN product. And that's really where the factor of 2 comes in. If you do it for the N product, it's 2, and PN product, it's 1 in KT over Q. You get what looks like the diffusion equation for a standard diode, although it's derived completely thermodynamically. But you get a really high open circuit voltage. So that says if the saturation current J naught is 0.27 femtoamps, the open circuit voltage is 845 millivolts. Voltages have been coming up. Eli published a paper with a passivated contact. I think it was 730 about 25 years ago or 20 years ago. That record stood for a long time. Sanyo just published 740 millivolts last 2 weeks ago at the Hawaii conference. So we're sort of inching towards that. And if you look at the efficiency of that structure, then it's 33%. So basically, if we go back to the chart I had before, and you had this silicon device limit of about 24% and Shockley-Queisser's thermodynamic approach of 33%, the question is kind of how do they merge together? And in that same paper, not so well remembered, Shockley, who had real intuition about some things, posited that the best you could do is 26% in a practical case. If you put in real things that might conceivably be possible someday with the technology, he had a little point at the end that said he thinks the practical limit would be 26%. So to fast forward to today, we've got a lot of understanding between then and now. We now think the practical limit is actually 26%. So Shockley nailed it pretty close. But there was a lot of hue and cry between them. Different researchers came along. And when they did this semiconductor device analysis, they all got pretty much the same results. You can see Lefersky in the mid-'60s. Martin Wolf came in and started playing with it, trying to figure out what's going on. And then something remarkable happened in 1980. The semiconductor device equation people suddenly were able to predict higher efficiencies. And how did they do that? Well, there's kind of two things. It was really Martin Wolf who conceived of both of them initially. One was light trapping, which Eli covered, where you can absorb the light more efficiently within the cell. And the other has come to be called minority carrier mirrors, or selective contacts, which I've shown the same thing that Eli showed, but in one cell. So that on the right-hand side, There's an electron mirror that's preventing the electrons from getting into the p-type contact, and on the left-hand side a hole mirror. And so the electrons that are generated there tend to come out at the Fermi level of the contact on the left, whereas the holes come out at the Fermi energy of the contact on the right. So that's the basic idea. This enabled Wolf to say, get rid of the p-n junctions altogether in his analysis and just say, we're going to stick these contacts on the cell. Nobody knew how to make them at all, but he was able to put that into his device equations, and he got that sudden increase in efficiency. And that's where that vertical jump in 1980 occurred after Wolf and Lifersky, excuse me, it was Lifersky that did both of those. So that's kind of where it stood for a while, and then the idea that the recombination in the cell should be limited by radiative recombination came in. If you look at all of the papers prior to that, the minority carrier lifetime was a phenomenological number. They would pick something like 1 millisecond. That was the recombination lifetime for minority carriers. And if you took the classic semiconductor device equations and say, well, that's all coming from Shockley-Reed-Hall type recombination, why don't we eliminate all the defects and make it infinite? Then the equations blow up and you get infinite efficiency. But that can't happen. You have to have radiative recombination. The reverse of the radiative absorption within the cell has to exist. And so people started working on how to best include radiative recombination. And Eli and his team came up with a model where they combined that with the exact absorption edge of silicon to get a much more realistic understanding of what the generation current would be, more accurate models of light trapping within the cell, and got an efficiency somewhere around 30%. Then along came a bunch of people and by the way, they had included Auger recombination, which is a big impact here. Along came people that discovered that the Auger recombination that goes on in these dilute electron hole plasmas is not the same Auger recombination that goes on in heavily doped semiconductors, where the exciton energy levels are screened out. In the dilute electron hole plasma, you actually get what's called exciton enhanced Auger recombination, and it's a little more active, and that brought the efficiency down a little bit to where it is today. There was also a few other things that had to go on. And one of those is photon recycling. So the computer models, one of the variable parameters in any kind of device model is the device thickness, which doesn't show up at all in a semiconductor, in a thermodynamic analysis. There's no device thickness number in the Shockley-Queisser analysis. It's just conspicuously missing, whereas it's conspicuously there in a semiconductor device model. You have to pick a thickness for the device, right? And it was shown that by simply including photon recycling, you could make the device as thick as you wanted, sort of infinitely thick, and it still had the same efficiency, because if a photon were absorbed deep within the cell, it would eventually produce another electron hole pair when it recombined radiatively, and it wouldn't be lost. So including all these things, we got to about 29% efficiency. This is the idea of photon recycling, which, by the way, essentially was clarified. There's this phenomenological constant called the radiative constant. What do you call it? B, the radiative recombination coefficient. Yeah. That was measured. What people didn't realize is when they were measuring it, they were including photon recycling because of the way the measurement was done. And any case, it turns out that the photon recycling in a silicon cell takes that radiative coefficient from 9.5 all the way down to 2.1. So that's sort of, it reduces the impact of this radiative emission because of the reabsorption within the cell. So in any case, the analysis following a thermodynamic approach after the Shockley-Queisser, which was also done by Eli, shows that if you take the cell and you add Auger recombination and incomplete absorption, you get the same result as you do with the device model. And if you go out to the far-hand side and eliminate the Auger recombination, it goes right back to the thermodynamic limit. So I think it's kind of interesting that all these theories essentially tie together now. People understand exactly why the solar cell has the efficiency that it has. And so now we have this sort of loss cascade, if you will, that starts with the thermodynamic limit, and which we can say fairly very strictly that our modern solar cell device models agree with the thermodynamic analysis completely. The thermodynamic limit is actually 33%, but that assumes a band gap of 1.15. That's where the optimum turns out in the Shockley thing. If you actually put silicon in, which is 1.12, you lose a little bit off that. If you put the incomplete absorption in, which is one of the contributions that Eli put in, that you just can't absorb starting right at the band gap, some of that light is by its very nature unabsorbable because of the low absorption coefficient. It drops that down to about 31. If you put the Auger recombination in, it goes to 29. So that's sort of the silicon limit cell. The interesting thing is that the transport losses within the cell, the energy loss in getting the electrons and holes out of the cell, which is modeled in a device model by having a finite mobility for electrons and holes, only subtracts 1/10 of a percentage point from that overall output. So, so that's sort of, I think, where the theory stands today. It's been much expanded to other structures, of course, but silicon, I think, remains the one that's most well understood in every little detail of its nuances. Now, if we go to, I didn't include the slides here, but if that 29%, if you then put realistic parameters in for what we think we can get in a real solar cell, it drops it down to about 26%. So after 50 years from Shockley's paper, or however long it is, we're essentially returned to his intuition that a silicon cell should be capable of about 26%. Essentially, no more is there to be had beyond that. So I think my time is out, Harry, so I'll stop there. Thanks.